Baroque building, which we shall refer to again on Thursday when we discuss the Ring, the famous boulevard that runs round Vienna. And so we won't linger with it at the moment. But it is, as you see, by two men. Von Hassenaar designed the exterior, and Semper designed the interiors. And you enter the museum into this magnificent staircase. To me, it sort of is redolent of the grandeur of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these incredible striated columns, the gilded capitals, the painted ornament on the ceilings, and the profusion of marble everywhere. It is very, very spectacular. And here you're rising up to what is the first floor, which is the floor which contains the Western art of art. In fact, on the lower floor, sort of mezzanine floor, there are the objets d'art, the carved stone ornaments and so on, which we will discuss as well. What I'm not discussing is the Egyptian, Greek, Roman treasures as well. That's a separate subject. But as you rise up the staircase, you can see, and there's a detail on the left-hand side, you can see the Theseus and the Centaur, which is by Canova, the great neoclassic architect, sculptor of Italy in the early 19th century. And it sort of is a foretaste of the grandeur and magnificence to come. Now, the first significant man who is responsible not so much for the paintings, but for some of the greatest objets d'art in the museum, is the Archduke Ferdinand of Tyrol. He was his father was Ferdinand I, so therefore his uncle was Charles V, we saw yesterday. But he was a second or third son. He wasn't the eldest son, so he has a minor position within the Habsburg hierarchy. And what he is responsible for is, for instance, the magnificent ewer you see on the right-hand side, but he receives this and three other items of exquisite refinement and unbelievable value and beauty. He receives these four carved stone items when he stood proxy for his niece, who was getting married to the King of France. And this was hardly an arduous job, one would think. And instead of, he still gets these magnificent treasures showered upon him. And so you can see his niece was Elizabeth of Austria. You can see there the onyx ewer. It's nearly a foot high, as you see, 28 centimeters high. The carving of the stone is absolutely exquisite, and the gold and the decoration of diamonds and rubies and emeralds enhances this item to absolutely top rank quality. It's absolutely superb. It was made in Paris in 1570, so it's brand new. The wedding that took place was just a couple of years afterwards. But that is overshadowed, and everything else is overshadowed, by the second of these treasures that he received, which is the famous Cellini salt. We know a lot about it, because Cellini, who was a Florentine goldsmith, Cellini was working in 1540, from 1540 onwards, for the King of France. The King of France at the time was the famous François Ier, Francis I. And we know a bit about it because in Cellini's autobiography, he refers to the fact that the king gave him a purse with gold coins in it to be melted down to create this gold salt cellar. Excuse me. The saliera. Now you can see it's actually quite large. It's 26 centimeters in height, and length it's over 33 centimeters, 10 by 13 inches. And the man who gave it to the Archduke Ferdinand of Tyrol was the king on the left-hand side, Charles IX, who was marrying Elizabeth of Austria. The salt cellar is the salt is contained rather in. Oh, I'm so sorry. What am I doing? You will get that. All very fiddly. The salt cellar is the central item, which is actually a boat. And it refers to the fact that on the left-hand side, the man is Neptune, who's the god of the seas, and the lady on the right-hand side is Tellus, the god of the earth. And below them are these dolphins. You can see the dolphins there. There's a seahorse, and the earth is represented by this quite hysterically funny elephant who's got a little cap on, which is rather weird. But it is, without any shadow of doubt, the finest example of its type in the world. It's absolutely world famous. And you may remember that in 2006, so that's 10 years ago, in 2006, this was actually stolen from the museum. And everyone was absolutely terrified because they thought, imagined, and it could have happened, that it was stolen simply to melt it down. And instead of which, the man that stole it was obviously a nutcase, and he'd climbed up some scaffolding which was installed. He had actually got through a window, and believe it or not, the warders within the museum at night time had heard this alarm going before. They said, "Oh, it's just the alarm, let's just forget about it, let's have another coffee." And so this chap went back with this item. He then buried it, and after that, he sort of wanted notoriety, I suppose, and then started writing letters, and this obviously enabled his arrest. But it fortunately survived, and hopefully the museum now has better security. But it is this quite unbelievably beautiful item, and it could be moved around the table because beneath it there are little ivory balls which allow it to roll smoothly around the table. Not that I think it's ever been used. There you can see in the details, the top show the Salt Cellar, which is basically a boat referring to the sea, and then the lower two illustrations show the sort of temple-type structure, which is the container for the pepper. So but it was meant to be practical, but it is, as I say, the most famous item of its type in the world. Given, as I say, to the Archduke Ferdinand for his arduous duty of standing in for the King of France at his wedding. So another item also actually owned by the Archduke Ferdinand is one of a plethora, not 10, not 100, thousands of these carved objects survive. It's just absolutely amazing. This is carved rock crystal, and of course it is attributed to a workshop in Milan because the Italians were the great experts in hard stone carving, and many of them, and we'll see an example later on, many of them will go and work for the Habsburgs in Vienna and then in Prague. It's quite big, 40 centimeters, 16 inches high. And you can see that it's exquisitely created. If you look at the neck of the heron, the way it's been carved actually sort of shows the feathers sort of on the bird's neck. It's quite extraordinarily elaborate and amazingly detailed. It is supposedly practical. The bird's body has been taken away, and you could actually fill it with wine or oil or whatever. In fact, if you did that, you'd have to pour it out of the bird's backside. But again, it's thought that it's never, ever been used. It's too fragile, and it survives absolutely intact. I mean, it's one of these items which are beyond compare, really. And there are gallery after gallery of these items on the mezzanine floor. And it would take, beautifully done, by the way, and they've embraced modern technology, and in fact, you can sit on a rather comfortable bench, and with an iPad you can look at all these items and all the details about them and so on. It's very well done. But to the art itself, and here is the first great collector whose collection forms a considerable part of the Kunsthistorisches Museum today, Rudolph II. Rudolph II was this strange, introverted, reclusive man who established his capital in Prague. He establishes his capital in Prague not necessarily because he liked it very much, but it was thought to be safer than Vienna, because I mentioned to you, and we shall discuss this more in detail tomorrow, Vienna was always threatened by attack, by invading forces from the east. So the capital, Prague was chosen as Rudolph's capital. He wasn't a very successful emperor. He was eventually deposed. He is, by the way, wearing the Order of the Golden Fleece. You can see the fleece suspended from his necklace. And although he wasn't a very good leader and a very good ruler, he was really probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, patron of art that the West has ever known. He had the money, and he was totally self-indulgent, of course. For years on end, he never showed his face to the people. He just sat in the Prague castle collecting more and more and more items and ordering more and more, because he summoned from his empire, principally from the Low Countries and also northern Italy, he summoned craftsmen of the highest quality, silversmiths, jewelers, sculptors, and so on, to create these superb objects that survive. And first off, let's just look, for instance, there's a bust here, and this is an example. Adrian de Vries today is regarded as one of the finest sculptors of his era, and his works are incredibly valuable. They do occasionally come onto the market. But here he's being very polite to Rudolph. He's making Rudolph be seemingly much more warlike and much more commanding, which he wasn't at all. But it is an example of the men who came to work in Prague for Rudolph. And in the collection of the Objets d'Art, there is on the right-hand side this figure of a Diana sitting on the back of a centaur. Diana, of course, is the goddess of the hunt, and so therefore her dogs rather at her feet. And the centaur, of course, the head of a man and the body of a horse, and she's sitting on his body, on his back. Well, that's all well and good. It looks lovely. But in fact, it's an automaton. It works. And it still works. And this is, again, not one, not two, not a dozen. There are just hundreds of these items in the collection. Well, that's untrue. A couple of hundred, maybe. But here you can see it working, I hope, if I can get it going. There we are. Yes, there we are. Oh, just watch for the arrows, by the way. There you are. Well, that's a good reminder what you can put on the stocking list for Christmas next year. It is amazing, absolutely. And there are lots of these. There's a ship that sails around. It was obviously to entertain the guests at dinner. And there's a ship that sails around and does amazing things. But let's go back to Rudolph. And Rudolph was a passionate collector of Dürer. And in fact, it's safe to say that all the great Dürers today, which probably are in the Met, in London, the National Gallery, in the Louvre, and so on, all the great Dürers would, at the time of Rudolph's occupancy in Prague, which would be late 1500s, early 1600s, they were all within his collection. This is one that remains in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and it's a very fine example. Dürer, having been to Italy, well, Dürer goes twice to Italy, and he brings back the Italian color, which you can see here, the Italian perspective that you can see here, but it also is still very bunched, it's still very busy. It hasn't quite got the balance and harmony of high Renaissance in Italy. It's the adoration of the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. All the peoples of the world, the martyrs, the pilgrims, the rulers, the populace, the priesthood, all coming to worship the Trinity. And the arrow points to the man who commissions it, who's called Landar. Landar is being, as it were, welcomed in. You can see there his hand, the hand of a cardinal welcoming him into the throng. And Landar was obviously a wealthy Nuremberger merchant. He'd made a lot of money, and therefore to enhance the possibility of him getting into heaven, he then established a charitable foundation. He established an almshouse, and this is very usual in the German states, and the almshouse was called the House of the Brothers, which meant that it accepted 12 people, usually craftsmen, usually sort of tanners or jewelers or whatever, furriers and so on. And they were men who had hit hard times and they needed to be cared for. And they were 12, like the 12 apostles, you see. So it was one of these charitable institutions. And so Landau was well known, and Dürer here painting this in Nuremberg for the patron. It was acquired by Rudolph, as you see, in 1585. And a detail of the right-hand side shows there is an emperor, but it doesn't, I don't think it refers to any specific emperor, but there is the emperor wearing the Order of the Golden Fleece. There is a king, and behind them is this chap, a soldier or a knight, dressed in shining armor, who looks very similar to the bloke on the right-hand side. He's got the same sort of pointing chin, the same slightly slitty eyes. They think it's the same. And if it is the same, his name is Wilhelm Haller, and this portrait of him is also in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Dürer almost invariably signs his work and dates his work, which is so hugely satisfying. And there is the statue of him, well, not the statue so much as there is his figure standing there next to this Latin inscription, which roughly translates that Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg has created this painting 1,511 years after the Virgin gave birth. That's very roughly translated. So the date is 1511. And it is one of the great Dürers, and it's got a superb frame, absolutely wonderful frame, which is actually not original, but it is based on the original when you see it in the museum. This is another portrait, again, of another very wealthy Nuremberger merchant. His name is Johannes Kleber, Kleberger, and he made his fortunes in France. And this rather strange idea of a sort of circular, it's almost like a coin extending out of its niche, is thought to be a French conceit, as it were. His name is given around the perimeter. And then the age, he's aged 40, so he's made his fortune. He's now retired back to Nuremberg. Dürer signs it right at the top there and dates it. And then on the left-hand side, it's Leo, the sign of the zodiac, Leo. He's obviously a Leo. And then there's his coat of arms. And again, this was acquired by Rudolph from Kleberger's son, purchased by him from his son. So these were not acquired by Rudolph, but they are in the collection, and they are comparable in date. I don't think Rudolph actually would have known about Holbein, because Holbein came from Switzerland, from Basel, Holbein the Younger, this is, and then he went to work at the court of Henry VIII, as you know. And this portrait of a young merchant is a stunning, stunning portrait. I mean, he's always got a very modern physiognomy, staring out towards you. His age is 28. You can see the date there. Probably this item was acquired by a man we'll come across in a minute called the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, and it was probably shipped out of Britain when Charles I was beheaded, when, of course, many of the royalists and many of the aristocracy fled, and obviously fled with their possessions. So it enters the collection in the 1600s. He undoubtedly is a German merchant of what was known as the Steel Yard, which was the base headquarters of the Hanseatic League in London, on the Thames, where Fleet Street is today. And then on the right-hand side is it's one of the Queens of England, one of the Queens of Henry VIII. Now, it goes divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And she's the one that died. She's the third wife, Jane Seymour. And again, probably this would also have entered the Habsburg domain, having been brought out of Britain when Charles I is executed. It's an extraordinary portrait because he shows her as a very pinched-faced little woman, really, not at all attractive, with wearing the most beautiful costume. But she has a tragic life, really, because as you know from Wolf Hall and all that, she becomes the queen after Anne Boleyn. And she only lasts for 17 months because in those 17 months she becomes pregnant and she does produce the longed-for son, who becomes Edward VI after his father dies in 1547. But she will actually only survive 12 days after giving birth to her son. Obviously, she dies from the giving birth. But it's all very, very sad. Anyway, it's in the Kunsthistorisches Museum today. Now, Bruegel is obviously one of the most loved painters, and there's an entire room filled with some of the most famous Bruegels in the world. And here you're looking at the peasant wedding on the left-hand side and the peasant dance on the right-hand side. And these are by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's very, very annoying, really, because the Bruegels are a huge family of artists, and we get them all muddled up. Whereas the Bach family, who produced all the beautiful Baroque music, at least had the sense of naming all the Bachs under different names, Johann Sebastian, Christian Emmanuel, and so on and so forth. So we know the difference. With the Bruegels, they're either called Peter or Jan, so you have no idea which one was which. And there is endless dispute. There's a big dispute going on at the moment by some museum because Peter Bruegel's son, who's the Peter Bruegel the Younger, who copied all his father's paintings. So it's an absolute minefield. But we don't have to be worried about that at all in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, because all the Bruegels there have a provenance which is absolutely crystal clear. Bruegel is amazing because he appeals to everybody. He appeals down the centuries, and he's one of the few people who remains permanently appreciated by all of us, whatever century we're looking at. And another example is Michelangelo, but then many artists go out of favor, become hugely popular, and then disappear again from view. However, this is one of his greatest works. It shows a wedding, which is obviously taking place in a barn. There are great bales of hay in the background, and the bride is seated underneath a piece of textile, just to give it a bit of panache. Next to her are her parents, but where is the bridegroom? And it is thought by modern research, but it's only thought, that the fellow right in the foreground there who's serving out the food is probably the bridegroom. And it apparently was a tradition in these peasant weddings. What they're being served is porridge. It's a very, very simple fair. They're a very simple, poor people. They live in terribly simple conditions. And even so, you see the chap pouring out liquid on the left-hand side. It certainly wouldn't be wine. It could be mead, but it's probably just water. Because they haven't they have a very, very substandard existence. But that doesn't matter, because it shows the dignity of man. That's what you relate to. It shows this wonderful reality of people as they are, warts and all. And this is why, right through the centuries, right up at the present moment, Bruegel the Elder is appreciated so marvelously. The little girl sitting in the foreground, you can see here, she's licking her finger because she's got a plate of food, and that wonderful little feather she's got in her hat, her party piece in her hat. Similarly, on the right-hand side, there's a disparate group, oddly unused to this peasant life, I think. There's a priest and a soldier. And again, nobody's terribly sure what that means, but probably the soldier has been suggested as being a portrait of Peter Bruegel himself, which is probably the case. But the two of them are of a very different world to the peasants at the time. So one wonders why he included them. There must have been a specific meaning. You can see the little girl with her peacock feather, the knife and the salt cellar in the peasant wedding. But in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, there is also 3 of this series of 6 paintings. These 6 paintings of the seasons, you start in January, February, you go through the months after that. The 6 paintings were originally ordered by an Antwerp banker called Jongelink. They then enter the Habsburg collection, and Rudolph then naturally has them shipped to in his possession in Prague. There were 6 originally, and there's a big blank space on the top right-hand side, which is the lost painting. There were all 6 of them in Rudolph's collection, we know that. And then somehow they just were dispersed. I showed you last year in Prague the haymaking, which is now around the Lobkowitz collection in Prague. That is the painting of the harvest, which is in the Metropolitan Museum, and then the other 3 are still in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. We'll look at autumn first, which is sort of November, December. It's the return of the herd. I find this so compelling. It's this wonderful colour, this amazing sort of autumnal tones, the solid cattle plodding along, this rather mysterious landscape, which is totally unreal, obviously metaphorical, and then the river flowing through the valley with a little town nestling, or little village nestling on the river's bank. And look at the details. There, that cow, she's got a mind of her own, that one. She's deciding to make a run for it, and she's sort of running off. And then the others on the lower left, they're sort of plodding along, that wonderful sort of bovine sort of sense of time and motion, and they wander backwards to their because they're coming down from the mountains, you see, or coming down from their summer pastures, and now going back to their shed in the winter time. The landscape, and then the little village you can see, which has a church. Obviously the grandest of the buildings is the church within the community. But best of all, and most famous of all, is the Hunters in the Snow. It's extraordinary that you can't imagine anyone doing it, but he does. He actually paints cold. He actually makes you feel cold. It's quite extraordinary, that sort of mistiness that you get on a really freezing day. And it's got all the ingredients. And this is a terrible time. These peasants are facing death. I mean, they're one step away from death. There's no food. The food's all been eaten up by then. And you have to go still after day, week after week, until eventually you probably get to March. And just then, you might get the flowers coming out. You might get some things to eat. But it's a very tough time for them. And all that is somehow encapsulated in this painting. And you can see there, for instance, the little woman on the bridge, carrying, have I got it right? She's over there. The woman carrying the sort of branches to burn for a little heat. The huntsman coming back, very distressed, very unhappy. All they've found, all their hunt has simply brought forth a fox, which you probably can't make it out very clearly, but that's the only thing they've got. Even the dogs are disgruntled. They again are plodding along. And it's got this sense of depression, the sense of freezingness, the sense of the whole atmosphere of a winter's day in one of these little villages. And here, look at this. The only birds around are crows who are waiting for something to eat, some dead person to fall on the ground. There again, you feel cold. Coldness is there. And you can see the dogs. And then there is something going on. There's a fire being burnt, being kindled. And that is to actually singe a pig, which obviously shows that the inn, because that's an inn, you can see the inside there, the inn has something to offer, to eat. But then again, it's finite. Once you've killed the pig and eaten it, basta, there's nothing left. So it's got a lot of meaning, a tremendous meaning. And again, it's this sympathy for mankind that he's showing. The inn sign is broken, so obviously again, everyone's lacking funds. The inn is called To the Deer, and that's a comment on the fact that the hunters haven't got a deer. So it's all very, very realistic. And it is actually one of the most amazing paintings, I think, in the whole wide world. It encapsulates so much of Bruegel's sympathy, of his representation of what life is like and what it was like then. And The Spectator, the English magazine, the weekly magazine, on their Christmas edition 5 years ago, had this painting on its front cover. And the huntsman there is Angela Merkel. She's got Sarkozy strapped on her back. Bearing in mind it's 2011, that is David Cameron and George Osborne heating their hands over a fire, and they're burning euro notes. And then the inside, which is broken, as you see, as it was in the painting, the inside is the flag of the European Union, and the inn is called the Totally Buggered. It's terribly, terribly clever. And then here, the Tower of Babel, also by Bruegel, of course, and the stupidity of mankind, the megalomania of mankind, the hubris of mankind. There you can see the town, and you get a big town, and you get the image, the idea of how huge this is. And there's the king with the peasants kneeling down before him, the masons cutting the stone. And here you can see the crane up there, which in detail you see that it has men inside, because the crane is actually worked by men walking like a hamster round and round and round with this wheel all the time. There's not a sort of job with prospects, I think. And so then the third actually of these great figures who are responsible for the great paintings in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. He's the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, and he was the governor of the Netherlands. And talk about being at the right time, at the right place. The Archduke was the governor of the Netherlands when, in the 1640s, 50s, when in England the turmoil of the Civil War takes place, and in 1649, the 30th of January 1649, Charles I is beheaded in Whitehall. And that precipitates many royalist supporters to flee. And they flee to the Netherlands. The Archduke Leopold Wilhelm is based in Brussels, and in the sale rooms in modern Belgium, there would have been vast collections, because the nobility fled, obviously with their plate, their jewels, their paintings, and then, of course, to live on, they have to sell. They sell the paintings to get something to live on. And so the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm had appointed as his court portrait painter David Teniers the Younger, and David Teniers paints this quite amazing painting. There are versions of this, but this is in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and it shows the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm with his hat on. It shows Teniers next to him, the artist, and all these paintings are Italian. Every single one of them was in an English collection. Every single one of them is now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And they are mainly by Titian and the Venetian school. So they're 100 years earlier than the date of this painting. Or even earlier than that, but 120, 150 years earlier. And so it's the most extraordinary inventory, really. And there you can see details. A late Titian, which is of what we would call an antique dealer. He was called an antiquarian then, and he supplied wonderful objects to Rudolph in Prague. His name is Jacopo Strada. This is by Titian. Titian is a very, very long-lived painter. He died, we don't know when he was born, but he died in his 90s in Venice in the late 1500s. He was a student in about the 1510 period. And with him, as another fellow student, is Giorgione. Giorgione is painting this painting. And in fact, if Giorgione had lived, probably he would have been even greater than Titian. But Giorgione dies of the plague when he's still a student. And there are only 7 known paintings or acknowledged paintings by him in the world, and that is one of them. It is enigmatic, as all his paintings are, and it is revolutionary. And it's 3 men, but apart from being the ages of man, we don't really know what they represent. They call it the 3 philosophers. Next to that is the Veronese, another of the great Venetian painters, of course. It's the wise men, the 3 wise men with the Virgin and Child, except the Veronese always is the most amazingly theatric, colourful painter. I mean, all the wise men and the Virgin herself actually all look as if they're going to a very, very special sort of fancy dress ball or something. They all are superbly rigged out. Again, Titian on the 2 sides here, on the side rather, on the right-hand side, there is called the Bravo. And it shows that life was not all that easy in those days. This is Titian painting this young chap who's come back from a party. He's got vine leaves in his hair. And he's suddenly been accosted by somebody who's got his hand on his shoulder. He turns around and his look is one of sort of fear, one of sort of tension, one of emotion. And so he should be, because this chap has got a dagger in his hand. You can see it just at the bottom. He's about to be killed. And then in sort of more calmer times, the wonderful lady, typical Titian, the colour, the extraordinary quality of flesh that he can paint, the hair, the Titianesque hair. This is his mistress called Violetta, and we almost certainly know that because she actually has a little violet popping out of her bodice. I was going to say bosom, but that's quite wrong. But there. And you can see in these, but it's extraordinary. I mean, what a gift to the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm, who was a great, great connoisseur, to have at his doorstep these sales just pouring out these amazing paintings that all, as I say, now survive in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Now, both Titian and Giorgione were pupils under the first great Venetian artist, Giovanni Bellini. And Bellini is famous for his altarpieces. It's quite exquisite, balanced, calm, beautifully painted, wonderfully colourful, reassuring, tender paintings of the Virgin and Child and various saints, a lot of them still in Venetian churches. He here paints, a year before he dies, in 1515, a lady at her toilette. Well, no lady, no woman of any standing would ever be painted in the nude in the 1500s. No one, except a prostitute. And so you have a very, very provocative painting, painted by Bellini. It's most unusual. It would never be attributed to Bellini, except it is definitely by him because it's signed and dated on that little bit of paper on the bench there. And it's a most extraordinarily beautiful painting, and today we aren't shocked by it necessarily, but we admire the quality of his art. Typical of Bellini too, of course, is this distant horizon, the fields, the Dolomites beyond, the view you would get, actually, looking from Venice onto the terraferma of the Veneto itself. This very, very wonderful painting, also acquired by the Archduke Leopold Wilhelm. And this one here, which is Tintoretto. The 3 great artists of Venice in the 1500s are Titian, Veronese, and Tintoretto. And Tintoretto usually painting rather strange, elongated, mystical figures. Here painting the most beautiful, beautiful representation of Susanna, who is just out of her bath. She's yet to realize that she's being espied by these two dirty old men looking at her. And it's a very unusual Tintoretto, and again, part of the Leopoldville acquisitions. He gets his artist Teniers to paint another of these composite paintings because he sends this one to his cousin in Spain. Leopold Wilhelm's cousin is Philip IV, the King of Spain. Philip IV was a great collector. And so here he's sending this painting, and why, in the foreground, that is, of course, Leopold Wilhelm, that is Teniers, the artist again. Between them is that man who was a Spanish dignitary, and obviously he would have then taken back this painting to the king. And it's very much sibling rivalry, sibling one-upmanship, because obviously Leopold Wilhelm is saying, as it were, to his cousin, not saying it directly, you chum, you've got some good painting you've got good painting in Spain, but bugger you, I've got much better ones, but I've got myself. He's showing off with this display of the Titians and so on. And they're just a detail of, again, that's a Titian, Christ performing a miracle. That is the second Giorgione of 7 in the world attributed to him, which is called Laura because she's got laurel leaves around her. And that is a Titian. Now, that painting there is the aunt of both Leopold Wilhelm and the King of Spain. That is why she's put in there. Her name is the Archduchess Isabella. She was the daughter of Philip II of Spain. And she, in fact, was the great patron of Rubens. And there, again, of course, a huge room filled with Rubens in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And one of, I think, the best Rubens I consider to be one of his greatest is the one that you see there at the end wall, which is the Ildefonso altarpiece. Rubens, of course, painting at the beginning of the Baroque era, painting in this amazing, flamboyant, elaborate, ornamental, rumbustious style. But here it's got a tremendous sort of poise and balance, I find. The Archduchess was a very great figure. Very often in the Habsburg history, very often the women, when they hold power, are much better than the men. And there she is, a very significant figure, the daughter of Philip II of Spain, and a very good ruler. She was a ruler of the Netherlands, together with her husband, who was a cousin, of course, from the Austrian side. So they're kneeling in worship with their patron saints behind them, in looking at the altarpiece, which is showing a Spanish saint, because she is Spanish, of course, a Spanish saint called Ildefonso, who in his writings, and he's a Reformation saint, he writes about the fact that he had this vision of the Virgin presenting a shawl to him. And so there she's presenting this item of clothing. The Virgin and her handmaidens are all Rubens' wife. Rubens, at the age of 55, marries a young girl of 17 as his second wife. And he falls totally, utterly, completely, and extraordinarily in love with this woman. And every painting of any woman from 1630 till Rubens dies in 1640 is his wife. There we can see his wife herself. There she is. Her name is Hélène Fourmont. And these two paintings are both in Vienna. The one is by Titian, and it's the girl of the fur wrap. Again, we think it's his mistress. And it's a very provocative painting for the time. And, of course, this fur is just about to slip off her shoulder to reveal the other one. So Rubens would have known that painting, because that painting was once in the collection of Charles I, the painting on the left. Charles I of England, because Rubens went to England. And as an ambassador, he would have seen this painting in Whitehall. And so then he paints his version of it, painting his wife. Now, very often Rubens' work is done by his studio, but this work could only have been done by Rubens. I mean, no artist would have ever allowed his assistants to paint his wife in this pose. And it is it's a wonderful sort of image of his love for her, but also the image of a very provocative pose as well. Helen Fouchemont in a fur wrap, or called Het Peltsken. When he died, when Rubens obviously dies before his wife, and when he died, she requested his executors to destroy this painting, which they never did, fortunately. And they're both in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. And there again, a praise cup. This amazing bit of artistry. It's been described as a sublime form and technically perfect. Makes this a masterpiece of the art of the stone cutter and of the goldsmith. This wonderful cup there, or bowl really very large. Again, one of these amazing treasures, one of a multitude in the museum. Now, just to run through some of the later paintings, here is Raphael, one of his unbelievably beautiful, absolutely perfectly balanced, calm, colourful, perfectly created, distant horizon, three-dimensional perspective. You can't get better than that. Raphael is the peak of artistic creativity in these works. And this is one of them. He paints a number of Virgin, Madonna and Child paintings, and they're now dotted around the world in all the big museums. And this is, I think, one of the most beautiful. 1506, he paints these paintings of the Virgin and Child in Florence. The Caravaggio, which is purchased by Joseph II, who is Maria Theresa's son. It's a rather conventional Caravaggio. Normally, Caravaggio is much more revolutionary, much more challenging, much more reactive, much more radical. But here it's the Virgin of the Rosary, because there's a festival, the Feast of the Rosary, and there is St. Dominic distributing rosaries to the people, and the only real Caravaggesque touch is the peasants who've got these dirty feet, and there they all, the dirty feet, which is a sort of symbol of Caravaggio. It's a very wonderful work. It was painted by Caravaggio when he was on the run. He had already now fled from Rome, where he lived and worked. But he'd fled from Rome because he'd murdered a man who was actually a pimp, and he was now living in Naples. Two Rembrandts, the large self-portrait dated 1652, the small self-portrait, which is, I think, probably a little later than 1655, but that's what the museum dates it as. What's extraordinary is that here Rembrandt, of course he paints hundreds of paintings of himself, ready to sort of improve and challenge his art. Here he's standing with his arms looking at you, and when he paints the large self-portrait here before you, he's lost his wife, he's been declared bankrupt, he's lost his son, he hasn't got much further to go, he's living in total poverty, and he still stands there looking out towards us, and he's determined still to carry on. And I think that's an amazing attribute, an amazing attribute. And the Vermeer, which was originally owned by a Czech nobleman, part of the aristocracy of the Habsburg Empire, and it is the art of painting, sometimes regarded by experts as one of his works, probably the greatest of his works, Vermeer's works. There are only 32 of his works in the world, and this is one of them. It's signed, which is not unusual, but it's not dated. He only dates 2 works. And then let's finish off with Madrid. Madrid is a new city. It's not an old city in the European terms. Madrid was only founded in the 1560s by Philip II. So this square is an addition to the modern city of Madrid, as it was then. Of course, it's now its most famous old square in the city. It's called the Plaza Mayor. And there you can see this very grand, marvelous, balanced, Italian-influenced civic square, civic environment, and reminding us that at the time, what we're talking of, the King of Spain was with Philip IV, I mentioned, this very great collector. Philip IV had the enormous fortune, of course, to appoint as his court portrait painter Diego Velázquez, who really
is one of the greats of all time. And of course, therefore we appreciate and know so much about Philip IV's court through Velasquez. Now, Velasquez's greatest work, which is not in Vienna, it's in Spain, it's in Madrid, but this work, I have a reason for showing it, is the famous Las Meninas. Las Meninas meaning the ladies in waiting, and they're the two ladies in waiting, attending to the little exquisite Infanta, the little girl. Velasquez himself is painting the work, at his easel. The king and queen in the mirror, reflected in the mirror, the detail of them there, coming in to see what their daughter's up to. And this little girl, and you can see a detail there on the bottom right, this beautiful, beautiful sort of hair she has, lovely golden hair, little cheeky face. And she was from birth designed considered to be married, or was married to her cousin in Vienna, who was the emperor. So from birth, she was already bespoke, as it were. There's one of these incredible dynastic marriages between the families. And so over the years, Velasquez will be employed by Philip IV to paint his daughter, because these three paintings are sent back to Vienna. It's rather like, your family perhaps is in Los Angeles or Sydney or somewhere, and they send back photographs of the children in the back garden. And but you don't normally, your family don't have Velasquez to paint the paintings for them. But here are these three works that arrive. With the little girl in pink. It's the same girl, of course, the Infanta Margherita Teresa, and she's the eldest child of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. There she is in pink, aged 2, in white, aged 5, and in blue, aged 8. And there are this amazing sort of collection of one of the greatest artists, portrait painters that's ever lived, painting this little girl. How he ever got her to stand still, I just don't know. But he did, or somehow managed. There she's looking out towards us, always knowing that she would then eventually be sent to Vienna to marry her cousin, the emperor. Her cousin, the emperor, actually was also her uncle. She, in fact, when she got to Vienna, insisted upon calling him uncle, which was a bit disturbing. But she is sent to Vienna at the age of 15 to be the wife of the emperor. And she's sent to Vienna and will be surprised to find that her uncle looks like this. And this is Leopold I. Now, in all fairness, I must be fair, Leopold didn't always dress like this. This was fancy dress costume. This was for a court fancy dress party. And so he didn't always look like this. But he, in fact, was a very loving husband. He actually was very, very fond of his cousin and now his wife. And she will actually give birth to 5 children. Each one of them dying at birth. And the 5th child will precipitate her death, and she dies at the age of 22. What a life. What a terrible, terrible life. And he then actually subsequently will marry, because it's the genes, you see. I mean, they're so muddled up now, they don't know what to do. And when then eventually she dies, he mourns her for the rest of his life, by the way. He's always referring to her in his letters and things. But he then marries again. In fact, twice. He has his 2 successive wives, and they are not of the Habsburg dynasty. But we will end with him this morning because he will be the emperor, not the greatest of emperors, not the most warrior-like or forceful of the emperors, but he'll be the emperor who is at the time of the siege of Vienna, which takes place in 1683. So we'll pick up with that tomorrow. And thank you very much indeed.